This is Dave Winkler at Naval History Book Reviews Author Chats. Today we are talking to Ryan D. Wadle. He is going to be talking about selling Seapower, public relations in the U.S. Navy 1917 to 1941. A little bit about Ryan. He's born in Iowa, grew up outside of Kansas City in Dallas. He did his undergraduate work at Iowa State, did his graduate work at Texas A&M, where he studied under the big guy on the left. That's Jim Bradford, standing with Bill Still and Phil Lundeberg, our inaugural group of Knox Award winners. Currently, he is the Associate Professor of Warfare Studies at Air University's E-School of Graduate Professional Military Education, where he teaches courses on air power and the history of sea power. And with that, we'll talk to Ryan. And exit. And there you are. How you doing? Good morning, Ryan.
Good morning. How are you?
Okay. So I guess the first question I have is, growing up in the Midwest, what got you interested in naval history?
So, growing up, my dad got me interested in history when I was growing up, especially in military history, but it wasn't like, obviously it's what you can pick up as a kid, but I would say I had, even that young, I looked almost equally upon military and naval history fairly equally. And so, but one thing I realized as I was, especially in as an undergraduate, because truth in advertising, I started off as an aerospace engineer, and then realized after a couple of semesters I was not going to make a very good engineer. And so I moved into history, and so one of the things I realized as I was going through my coursework as an undergraduate was, even as much as I was loving the operational and strategic history of wars and campaigns, just even in those surveys, the questions I always kept asking myself was like, okay, so how do they, how did these military organizations, how do they prepare for war? What do they get right? What do they get wrong? And what do they learn from previous conflicts? And so that was always the thing that animated me. And so when I first got to graduate school, I had a different idea about how I was going to, use that interest. But early in my second year of my master's program, took a course with Dr. Bradford, and I would say the rest is history from there. He, we realized very quickly that what I wanted to study and the kinds of questions I was asking, there was a lot of source material out there. And so that's the reason why I ended up writing my master's thesis on naval aviation in the fleet problem system.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so then Dr. Bradford kind of steered you towards taking this on into the public relations realm?
Yeah. So when I got to the dissertation, so we had an idea of perhaps extending that project, and that didn't end up working out. And so we were, we were kind of brainstorming one day, and we realized, like, because at that point I was already taking courses on film. I had a lot of film knowledge. This is another thing that I got from my dad growing up. And so, and I had already done some work with Dr. Bradford on processing the papers of the Naval Order of the United States, which is a veterans organization that actually gave birth, at least in part, gave birth to the Navy League back in 1902. And so, we realized, like, there was a way of taking all of these disparate things that I had been doing and working on and kind of tying them together in a single project. And, and it was also one of these things where we realized, as, just in looking around, this was not a project that had been given a lot of thought, or at least recent thought. The only real examples I found of studying Navy public relations was there were two. There was a master's thesis and a dissertation directed at Wisconsin by Scott Cutlip. He was a famous public relations scholar. And so he had a couple of Navy public affairs officers go through his program as students. but both of those were written in the late 60s, and so by the time I was working on my project, it had been good 40 years before that had gone through, and there's so much more material that had been processed than what those two guys had access to. And so anyway, so it was a field that we very quickly realized was ripe for investigation.
Oh, excellent. So, I guess one of the first things you discovered is at the end of World War One, the Navy helps win the Allied victory in World War One, but it comes into the 1920s with kind of an image problem, so why was that?
So I think there's a lot of, there's several different reasons why this happens. I think on some level it's the Navy has a lot of self-inflicted wounds after the end of the war. There's the very public fights between Admiral Sims and Secretary of the Navy Josephus Daniels. That gets into the medals controversy. It gets into how prepared was the Navy for war. In the middle of that, Sims apparently leaks what's going on at Newport with the Newport scandal to his friend, who's the editor of the newspaper in Providence, and then that editor ends up spreading the news around about what's going on in Newport. For those who aren't aware, basically you had untrained investigators trying to entrap both Navy sailors and also local citizens in hetero and homosexual acts as a means to purge the town of what they saw as scurrilous influences. It's really the part about investigating the civilians that really causes all the problems with on the image side. So you've got all of these very public battles. One thing that's very interesting with Daniels is so he has a background as a newspaper editor, and so in some ways he actually gives rise to the practice of public relations within the Navy, but he there's a couple of decisions he makes during World War One that kind of cause some problems. He gets into a very public battle with the Navy League, which actually is probably more the Navy League's fault in that instance. And so the Navy League is banned, and so the Navy League had kind of positioned itself as a lobbying group and public relations group, and so they're kind of on the outs. Daniels also tries to restrict the cooperation that's going on with Hollywood, which at that point is still relatively limited and not really well codified yet. And so there's a lot of depictions of the war that you might expect to see, speculative depictions of the war that just don't materialize because that relationship breaks down. But the single biggest thing about why the Navy suffers after the war is the public starts to associate the naval arms race that happens before World War One as the cause of the war, or as the primary cause of the conflict. And so as soon as the war comes to an end, Daniels is continuing to press for the Navy to finish its big Authorization Act from 1916, which was 10 battleships and 6 battle cruisers. And then there's another authorization that's supposed to double that on the table. The second one goes away, it's traded away during the Paris negotiations. But it's the fact that the Navy is trying to build this big new force and essentially starting an arms race, and so you start to see a lot of uneasiness. And then finally, it's the New York World and William Borah who really bring this out into the fore of Senator Borah, who really call this into question of why are we building this new Navy when the only two rivals we have left are our allies from the war.
Okay.
And that causes a massive public outcry and a big show of support against naval construction. Okay,
so one of the things which the way they start to handle it, and the Navy League, you mentioned that. I wrote a paper for Seapower magazine about 15 years ago about the origins of Navy Day, and I did some research in the archives at the Navy League and came away with an article that said, this was a great idea by the Navy League, and then I read your book and you kind of prove me wrong.
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. So, the public outcry against arms construction leads to the Washington Conference, and so the Navy views this as kind of this seismic event that really upsets its place in the world. The Navy had been growing at that point almost nonstop for 30 years. They view themselves, the officer corps and its leaders view themselves on the cusp of achieving maritime supremacy over the British. And so the fact that this supremacy is depending on how you read it, negotiated away at Washington. The British take a very different view of this, as you might expect. And so so in the wake of Washington, the Navy is very reluctant to try to push the case for building the Navy up to treaty limits, which the Navy still had some growth to do to actually get up to the caps set at Washington. And so in order to try to reinvigorate their standing with the public, they come up with Navy Day. And so this starts with Assistant Secretary of the Navy Theodore Roosevelt Jr. He has a meeting with this woman who's the widow of a Navy club in New York. And so, the widow's asking for support. He's not really terribly interested in that, but apparently over the course of their conversation, he comes up with this idea of maybe there should be like a day to celebrate the Navy. And so he takes it to his aide, which is Captain William Pratt, who later becomes the Chief of Naval Operations. And he socializes this with some other senior leaders. And so Pratt draws up the outline of what becomes the first Navy Day himself. And then they try to figure out how do we get the public to buy into this? And so the solution they come up with is let's make it appear the Navy League has come up with the idea. And so the Director of Naval Intelligence, which is Captain Luke McNamee, he has a back channel correspondence with the mover and shaker of the Navy League, William Howard Gardner. And so he sends him a letter that it's almost verbatim of what Pratt drew up, and he says, and the gist of the letter is like, only show this to the president, but present this to us, and we will act surprised. And so so that's where it comes from. And so what this leads to, though, is for the rest of the interwar period. So Navy Day is going to fluctuate in size. Really, the first really successful one is 1923. But there's always this kind of sham sponsorship, by the Navy League. Even though if you actually look at a lot of the documents, most of the planning, at least on the logistics side, is being done by the Navy itself. The Navy League is doing some crafting of the message, but in general, the Navy is doing the lion's share of the work in terms of putting on Navy Day as an annual show.
And of course, Navy Day is October 27th, which happens to be the birth date of Theodore Roosevelt Jr.'s dad.
Yes. Yeah, and that's one of the things that Pratt comes up with, and so they have to get Teddy Roosevelt Jr. to agree to that date, because that was the one that they thought might work the best. Yeah,
and actually Navy Day kind of lasts until the 1970s, when the Navy decided to celebrate its birthday on October 13th, and all the services kind of like consolidate their Armed Services Day in May. So. Although sometimes you hear about Navy Day, it's mentioned in local media here. The other ways in the 20s and 30s, there's a partnership that develops late in the 30s with Hollywood. There's some really good films that come out. That's probably what you referred to earlier. Can you speak of?
Yeah, so so the as long as the film industry has existed, they've made films about the Navy, and occasionally they had cooperated with the service, but that relationship had kind of broken down a little bit in the early 1920s, and so there's not really many films made about the Navy or with the Navy's help. And then starting in 1925. is when you see Hollywood starting to show more interest. And so there's a film that comes out called The Midshipman that's filmed at the Naval Academy. And in fact, the star of the film, Ramon Navarro, who was a big silent film star of the day, they actually have him go through the graduation ceremony and getting the real graduation ceremony that year and getting a diploma, just to kind of add to the realism. And so, and this is part of this wave of films that is showing more interest in Navy and military matters. There've been kind of a little bit of a hiatus on that after the end of World War I, but things like What Price Glory, King Vidor's The Big Parade, which is a huge hit in 1925, really starts to show Hollywood that there's money to be made by making films about the military. Maybe not necessarily about combat, but at least about the military and the different services. And and so what they're realizing is that by working with the branches of the military, they have distinct settings. It can help to heighten realism. But they're also making a play for like middle class audiences. They want to make films about respectable topics. The film industry at this time is sometimes seen as catering to vulgar tastes. And it's really kind of in some ways escaping the image of film from its early days, in which film was not seen as a respectable medium. Basically, you were poor or some kind of pervert if you were going to a film, in the early 1900s, during the birth of the medium. So they're trying to make a play for middle class audiences. But what the Navy is starting to realize is that they can use this to their own ends to try to put their own distinct messages into films, and so to try to make sure that the public is seeing what the Navy wants them to see of the service of their men and also of their ships.
Okay. You also mentioned, of course, you give a shout out to the Naval Historical Foundation's formation in 1926. Dudley Knox and William Moffett are two of the key figures in your book. Can you talk a little bit about those two characters?
Yeah. So Dudley Knox, he's endlessly fascinating guy, and so he does a little bit of everything in his career, but and he had spent time on Sims's planning staff during World War I, and then after the war, he's put on, he retires. But he's basically put on this continuing duty as the head of the Naval Historical Section. And so, but he's one of these guys who first realizes the power, the potential power of public relations. And so he's wary of what's going to happen to the Navy, after the war, because he thinks the public is going to, turn on this idea of naval construction now that you've had this great war. And so he spends a good chunk of the 1920s as kind of a behind-the-scenes mover and shaker of public relations. So he's not always really directly connected to policy, but he always is willing to throw himself into debates. And so, there's, for a while, he does this very public series of debates with Hector Bywater, who's this British-born but more or less American journalist, over the nature of the potential arms race between Britain and the United States. He also will engage in this feud with the magazine Scientific American, over their perceived pro-British stance. He spends a lot of time in the 1920s trying to root out what he saw as like this insidious British propaganda against American naval construction. And so, but I think his contribution on the historical side ends up being more important. He creates the Naval Historical Foundation. One thing that's not in the book is, I talk a little bit about Knox's advocacy for a Navy museum in the 1930s. And so one of the last plans he draws up, before World War II, this really incredibly ambitious plan of putting the Navy Museum on the Potomac, and pretty much every major naval vessel that had historical value was supposed to be housed there. And so he was talking about trying to round up the Oregon, not the Oregon, but the Olympia, the Hartford, the Constellation, and several other ships that were going to be housed in this grand museum. So he's really big on the advocacy side. Moffett, so Moffett has this really unique position. So he's the the head of the or the chief of the Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics. So the Navy Bureau system is incredibly powerful. The heads of the bureaus have a lot of bureaucratic power. And so Moffett is able to use this position of power as a means to push for the advocacy of naval aviation. And this is really important in the early 1920s as, you have Billy Mitchell trying to push for a unified air service. There's the tests, obviously there's the test of the Ostfriesland off the Virginia Capes in June of 1921 that actually ends up pushing the Navy towards making aviation more bureaucratically strong within the service. And so Moffett, so what's really interesting is Moffett is kind of running his own public relations campaigns from BUAIR that are in some ways separate from the official public relations campaigns, which after 1922 are being run by it's the office of the office of why am I blanking right now? Oh gosh. Anyways, but it's being run by a small office within within naval intelligence and so under the CNO at the time, and so Moffett sometimes gets a little bit of support. Those guys are drumming up press contacts, but in general it's Moffett moving trying to move his ships, move his men into advantageous positions. This backfires on him in 1925 with the crash of the Shenandoah and the near loss of the PN-9 flying boat, which is trying to fly from California to Hawaii. Thankfully, the boat and the flying boat and its crew survive, and that actually gets turned into a movie later on, several years later. But Moffat's able to survive that, and so in fact Hollywood, so getting back to this idea of Hollywood actually ends up becoming kind of a supporter, kind of this inadvertent supporter of Moffat's goal to publicize naval aviation in the 20s, because he doesn't really want to expose his ships and aircraft the same way he had been earlier in the 20s in the fights against Mitchell. And so you have a series of naval aviation films coming out in the 20s and 30s. Many of them written by Frank Spigweed, who was a former naval aviator and racer who's partially paralyzed in an accident in his home. And so he turns to screenwriting as a means to cover his debts. And so you have all of these films that come out and really do a lot to publicize naval aviation in a way that really kind of builds off of what Moffett had been trying to do earlier in the 1920s.
Okay, so kind of wrapping up, your conclusion is kind of that the Navy's public outreach really helped put the Navy in a much better posture with the American public as the nation approached the World War II.
Yes, yeah. So during the 1930s, this relationship with Hollywood deepens. And the Navy becomes more adept at this. Now, I'm not going to say that Navy public relations is not the single biggest factor in terms of why the Navy is prepared for the war, or necessarily that they even had this this outsized effect. So and one of the things I try to get into in the book is trying to trace direct effects from their policies is incredibly difficult. But if you look in terms of like the process by which they went about their jobs, it becomes a much more professional and much more expansive institution throughout the 1920s and 30s, and then finally in 1941, so whereas public relations had been under the CNO's responsibility since 1922, it is actually put directly under the Secretary of the Navy, Frank Knox, in May of 1941 when he creates the Office of Public Relations. And so up to that time, the head of Navy PR had been, it was an 05 billet, and for most of the interwar period, he only has like a few officers and a civilian aide as his staff. But by 1941, that staff has grown. It's up to, I want to say, about 40 by the time by May of 41, and then the chief job is actually elevated to a flag billet, and so you have a rear admiral Arthur Hepburn put in charge of the Office of Public Relations. And so there's a lot of organizational growth, but a lot of it is really gets down to the process by which they do the job. It becomes much more professional, over the course of the interwar period. And one thing I do want to say is what's really interesting is they're not always getting a lot of guidance in terms of crafting policy. And so they're kind of falling back on kind of these tropes of Navy culture. What is the Navy interested in, and trying to portray that. So if you're thinking about some of the current debates over how the Navy interacts with the public, there are times where what they do kind of gets into this idea of strategic communication as opposed to public relations, which are two very different concepts in terms of like how you interact with the public, and so especially on the Hollywood side, that gets much more into this idea of strategic communications than I would say the traditional interaction with the press that typically defines the PR business at that time.
Okay, well, let me close there, but before we close out, you are working on a book on Admiral Harry Yarnell. Just give us a little, what got you interested in that, and how far along are you?
So I got interested in Admiral Yarnell. I didn't really know much about him, until when I was working on my master's thesis. I found his collection of papers at which was then the Naval Historical Center, now the Navy History and Heritage Command, and I was fascinated by just how big this collection was. Recognizing that I don't think anything's been written on him. It also caught my eye that he's from Iowa. So he was born in Independence, Iowa, which is a little town near Waterloo. He actually grew up. William Leahy was actually born like a county or two over. So there's that Iowa connection, but Yarnell is someone who kind of ends up help building the fleet that wins World War II, but yet he's kind of this behind the scenes mover and shaker. So he spends time as a strategist under Sims, and that's actually really what I think a lot of people know for is his planning acumen. So he spends time after World War I as a war planner. But he sometimes has influence over submarine policy. He's one of the Navy's first carrier commanders. He's the commander aircraft squadrons of the battle fleet for a few years, and kind of in some ways kind of helps pick up from where Joseph Reeves left off in terms of developing carrier tactics. His last regular assignment is as the commander of the Asiatic Fleet. When the Japanese push into China in the late 1930s, and so and he's got this really adept strategic mind. He actually is called back to service a couple of times during World War II, so he's one of these people that just keeps popping up in the historical record, but yet has really not, I would say, quite gotten the recognition he deserves for really building the modern Navy. And so yeah, that's the project I'm working on. For the most part, I've completed the research. There's a few odds and ends. I was going to do the summer. Unfortunately, obviously with everything going on, that has kind of put my travel plans on hold. But the goal is to have the manuscript into it's under contract with Naval Institute Press. The goal is to probably have it to the press in the next 12 months, 12 to 18 months or something like that, and then so then it'll be out in print sometime after that.
Okay, well, good luck with that. Now, to get selling Seapower, how would you advise somebody to best pursue that?
So you can definitely buy the book off of Amazon, but I would strongly recommend buying it from the University of Oklahoma Press. The book is from the Oklahoma Press. And I would just say it's always a good idea to directly support your university presses. University presses are they're like a lot of the publishing industry, they're going through hard times right now, and so anytime you can find a way to directly support a university press, please do so. They put out a lot of good work on many different topics, and so anyway, so yeah, so if you go to the University of Oklahoma Press site, you can find a link and go from there.
Okay. Well, thanks a lot, Ryan, for this edition of Naval History Book Review Author Chats. And thanks again for your time.
Yeah, thank you. Take care.